Can you hear me? You can. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. My screen is immediately going into screensaver mode, which I should have disabled. So I am, like I was just introduced, great introduction. I am Hakim. My profession is being a developer designer combination. I mostly identify as being a developer, but I do a lot of design as well. And my real professional interests kind of lie in designing and building, implementing user interfaces for creative tools. So things like a drawing app or a video editing tool, etc. I am also very interested in working on open source projects. I released a lot of open source libraries and projects in the past, and just work on a lot of UI experiments and concepts, etc. And I've been fortunate enough, to be able to marry those two things and combine those two interests into what I'm working on today, which is Slides, a platform for creating and editing presentations. So today I'm going to highlight some of the UI patterns that emerged sort of in the process of developing Slides. I've worked on Slides for 6 years now, and been in full control of the whole UI design and development. So I've learned a lot in that process, and I want to talk about some of the implementation details that I obsess over as I work on my projects, and what makes or breaks a good UI. But briefly, before we get into that, like I mentioned, I've had a very long-standing interest in UI development, UI concepts. I love working on that kind of stuff. And I want to show you a few of my personal projects, some things that I've created for, to try to be useful, and other things just for the fun of it, just to give you an idea of kind of where I come from. So this first project, this is a browser extension called Focus, and it's an idea I had for further emphasizing text selection on a page. So when you start selecting text here, you both get the text highlight, but you also de-emphasize the rest of the page to bring your selection even more into focus, and it highlights in any direction that you're dragging as well. Brief show of hands, how many people write HTML and CSS here? Like, what's the designer to developer ratio? That's the developers? Great, awesome. So very, very briefly, how this works technically, I'll touch on the higher level, we'll go into more a little bit later. This uses JavaScript to find the text range that you've selected, and from there you can infer which DOM nodes are selected by going upwards in the tree, and you can get their bounds, and the actual overlay effect is drawn using Canvas and just cutting out a rectangle. Another little UI experiment concept, this one's called Monocle, or Monocle Lists, the best name I could come up with. It's sort of a parallax scrolling list. So when you scroll these list elements, they kind of zoom into view or magnify into view when they hit a specific point. And this is actually based off of an old Flash site that I saw way back when, and I tried to re-implement it with HTML and CSS. And this actually consists of 3 separate lists. So you've got one list up top, one at the bottom, and one much larger list in the middle with this overflow hidden. And then they're kind of synced together to achieve this illusion of a magnifying list. So on the more useless end, this one, it's a grid of checkboxes. This is CheckWave. It's a grid of checkboxes, and when you uncheck a checkbox, it generates a wave of unchecking checkboxes. It looks like this. And when you check a checkbox, again, it generates a wave depending on where you clicked. So, and that's all it does. That's all it does. And I love working on this kind of stuff where you take something that's so, boring, traditionally boring as a checkbox, and you try to do something fun with it to surprise people. And yes, next project. This one is Flipside, the last little UI concept I will show you. This is an idea for a button that merges in a confirmation action. So when you press this button, it flips over, and on the flip side, you get your option to confirm or cancel that action. And I'm really happy with how that animation came out. And the reason why I think it works well is it flips differently depending on where you press. So if you press the left edge, it will flip, as if you punch the card in that direction. If you press the bottom, it will flip towards the bottom. So yeah, that gives you an idea of sort of who I am. I'm defined by my work, right? But beyond all these smaller projects, one project I've worked on for a really long time, a personal project called RevealJS. It's a web-based presentation framework, a way for people who know how to write HTML and CSS or Markdown to kind of combine that into publishing presentations on the web. It's completely open source. anybody can use it for free, modify it, and people have. It's been really exciting. But the one major limitation with this was always that you needed to know how to write code in an editor to create presentations. So that's where we ended up with Slides. So Slides is the company that I co-founded. We're a two-person company. We have been from the start for the past 6 years. So scaling back from a lot of what we've talked about today up until now, where this is kind of going to be a lot about how to approach design within a smaller business and also a technically heavy business. Me and my co-founder were both technical people, but I obviously have an interest in design and user interface development. So we're going to take a look at some of the specific components, UI patterns that I've developed, and it's been a really fun time these past 6 years because I've worked on UI development for a very long time, and I've kind of been able to condense all of that into building the UI for Slides, where I've had full autonomy and complete freedom to do whatever I wanted. And I've experimented a lot and kind of done my UI and concepting work, but within a product. So moving on. One moment. First area that I wanted to talk about a little bit is loading, which is not a very exciting topic, but it's sort of this necessary evil in a UI and a web app. You always need to provide loading feedback. You send off requests to a server. You need to show the user what they're waiting for. In an ideal world, and in some scenarios, you can get away from that already, where wherever we delete something in a UI, if you have a list, you're removing a presentation or something, the moment the user presses the delete button, you instantly get rid of it from the UI, which makes it feel like the action was instantaneous, but then you send off the request to the server and you do the work in the background. And in the 1% chance that there is an error, you can come back, you can show the user a nice and friendly error, but in the other 99% of cases, the deletion action will just have felt a lot faster. So that's one kind of way that you can cheat loading, but in many cases, you still need it. So I wanted to show you and talk a little bit about how I think that can be done in a good way. And from this point forward, we're going to be clicking through a lot of UI. Let's see. I have that saved, perfect. So whenever there's a form element or that you can submit on Slides, we have this button where you press the button itself turns into loading feedback. And we try to do this throughout the whole app. I always think that loading feedback should be visually anchored to what you're interacting with. So the thing you're pressing, within that space on the screen where you're already focusing is where you should be seeing feedback for that action. So if I delete my deck here, again, the button itself turns into loading feedback. If I recover it, the button turns into a spinner and shows me that the action for recovering is what's spinning. And I really love this pattern because it means loading feedback becomes very, very immediate. You press something and you're already focusing on that area of the screen, and that's where loading appears. It's also very easy to understand what it is you're waiting for because the loading feedback is literally visually anchored to the element. And thirdly, it's non-blocking, which is another benefit. Where you're waiting for something to spin, you can interact with the rest of the page. So this approach towards loading is actually something that we do. It looks differently, but I take the same approach to loading all over Slides. So another example, just jumping into the media library within our editor now. And if you upload files here, let's say we're going to upload 3 videos. I press the blue upload button to initiate the upload. So the blue button is what kind of spawns loading feedback here. It looks visually very different from the button before, but it's the same thought process of always anchoring a response to your interaction to the element that you interacted with. Right. This is actually an open source project as well, something called Lada that I released a while back now. It's this idea for including loading indicators or spinners within buttons. So it comes in multiple different styles. And one cool detail is if you have trackable progress, like how many bytes you're uploading to the server, you can show a progress bar within the button as well to include that data also. The next area that I want to look at is, I think Popups are sort of a UI pattern that nobody likes, and for all the good reasons. And I don't just mean the obviously bad ones, like a big advertisement on a news site. I mean pop-ups more, even in a good-looking way, I think are not usually a good UI pattern, like the jumping back again, the media library here, that's a big pop-up in the middle of the screen. And I really rarely, and I don't even like this interface that much, to be honest, but, and I designed this, but it appears in the middle of the screen, it kind of covers everything, it's centered, it doesn't attach itself to anything, there's no context. You lose context when you get into this UI. And I think pop-outs, popovers are a much better UI pattern. The reason why pop-ups are a really good pattern for you as a developer, for me as a developer, is they're so easy to implement. You click a button in my UI, I can't fit the options I need to show in line. Oh, great! You slap them in a pop-up and then slap the pop-up on the top of the screen and call it a day. But I think popovers, pop-outs are a much better UI pattern, which we've used extensively in slides, and I'm referring to simple little pop-outs like this, right? So this one specifically is for making your presentation private or public. And this goes back to what I was saying with loading indicators before. I always think that the area you're interacting with should spawn the follow-up action, whether that's loading feedback or a next interaction, anchored to where you're already interacting. And that provides a really seamless flow where I want to change the visibility of my deck. I click this, I can clearly see how this is visually anchored to what I pressed, so I know what it relates to. It doesn't even need a title. And then I can make it public or private. And they're still as easy to implement as well, which is why it's one of my favorite UI patterns that we use all the way throughout slides. We use them for editor settings. We have multiple different types of prompts, right? If you want to add a different slide background, you can add an iframe background in an accordion. This is a pop-up that's an accordion. You can pick a color. You can have prompts, confirmations, and much more complex ones too, like this one for adding new slides, which has a lot more UI in it. But I really love that flow, and I love contextual UIs like this that appear in the area where you're already interacting. So whenever I set out to build a new feature into our editor, I always try to think about the complete flow that a user is going to have to go through to complete my action and what they're going to have to click through. So to give you another example of where I think this works out well with these contextual UIs, if I wanted to edit one of my comments here in this conversation, I'll press the COG wheel, and then the follow-up interaction is, do I want to edit or delete? I want to edit, then the follow-up to that, again, is another component that pops out right where I'm already interacting, and I can get my emoji window going and add a little emoji and tab down to save. And that whole interaction took place within 150 by 150 pixel area, which I think makes for a really, really seamless flow for me as an end user. No matter what my input device is too, if you're using your fingers, whatever you're using, you're already in that zone interacting. So that's one of my favorite UI patterns. Something else I wanted to talk about is something I call the wireframe, which is maybe not the best name, but it's sort of the kitchen sink for all of our UI components. It's the poor man's design system where we're not a big enough of an organization to really flush out a full design system. I'm the only one working on the front-end edited design, so I'd only be making it for myself, which may still be a good reason for having it. But the poor man's design system looks like this. It's slice.com/wireframe, and we've just kind of dumped out all of our components, all of our commonly used components, in all of their different configurations. And this, I think, is still immensely helpful. We've got the pop-out component we're just looking at in all its different configurations, where I've got multi-select ones, and there's the multi-line input one, and the visibility one, etc. And in a way where they're really densely packed together, and I can test them all out. And when I make changes, I can manually easily go in and test how those changes kind of impact other configurations. And they're also, and this page is also super useful for automated testing. If you use something like Cypress.io to test your UI, you can, using this page, you can test the functionality of your UI components separately from the application logic, which I think is a good way to approach it, because then that your real application tests are not failing for some silly UI error. Another component that I'll show really briefly here while we're on this page is notifications. So notifications are this little black message in the bottom right corner. We use these for a bunch of different things, sometimes for errors. And when we show an error, we always try to show a custom error message for what just happened. But sometimes you you can't predict what's going to happen, and the error is unknown, right? When there's an error like that, what we do is we rotate between a few different error messages. So if the error were to appear multiple times, if a user sees multiple errors, they'll see you ran into an unexpected error. Next time it's something wrong, can you try again? Next time, oops, something went wrong, which I think just adds a little bit of human tone to the error messaging instead of making it feel so very robotic and like a kind of dead end. Right. The next UI pattern I want to talk about is hover menus. This is something that I think people tend to stay away from a lot, and again, for good reasons. I think if they're implemented in the right way, they have a good place in the UI, and they can be really convenient. You just hover over a button and immediately click something without the multiple clicking. And the common pitfall with a menu like this is, let's see, is this. So you try to go from the menu and you can't reach that goddamn button, and it's so frustrating, and you just quit and you cancel your subscription and you lose a customer. No, but this is really annoying, really frustrating. So there are multiple ways to approach this, right? To make this better. And like I said, I think if they're implemented in the right way, this menu is still really useful. So what we've been doing since when I first built this menu component is I added a timeout, which is a very easy to implement solution where whenever you go over the menu button, or the anchor is what I call it, the button that says hover menu, when you go over the anchor and you move outside of it, there's a 0.3 second delay before the menu will go away, which gives you some leeway to cross diagonally to the element that you want without the menu going away. But then that has its own separate artifacts or side effects. Namely, when you go over the button really quickly, the menu will still linger there, which is kind of like a weird lag. And even more so, you still are dependent on how fast the user is going to move. So if you cross from the hover menu button too slowly, well, the menu's going to go away. Well, you could solve that by increasing the timeout and making the lag even worse. So that's kind of where we've been at up until now. And now I wanted to show you, because I recently spent some would argue too much time on just exploring how this could be made better. So we'll go back to the wireframe page again to conveniently skip to the menu section where we have all these menus. The one we've been seeing in the presentation there is right aligned. So the right aligned version of the menu, when I cross here and I go over to my menu options, is not going to go away. And it's not going to go away regardless of how long I stay there. And after a lot of trial and error and experimenting, I'll show you what it is that I came up with for this. So we'll turn on a debug mode, top secret, don't look at the URL. And so now we'll be able to see sort of the underlying workings of this, which is the hit area that I'm drawing for this element. So instead of just trying to use a timeout, I've started drawing a dynamic hit area depending on the proportionate sizing of the anchor and the menu and their relative position to one another. So this will look very differently depending on how they align to one another. If you have a bottom aligned menu, well, in this case, it's actually a pretty bad example, but there you can see it. It goes upwards instead. This uses SVG to draw dynamically, which has a huge benefit because it means that the component will work no matter what the setting. If I scroll downwards and the menu is offset upwards, it will draw a different hit area depending on their relative position to one another, which makes it super, super flexible. And of course, the same thing again from up top. So you get a hit area that will cover your most likely trajectory no matter how those two elements relate to one another. And this is the kind of stuff I love obsessing over. So I spent, a full day at least. I was not imagining that was going to be my day when I set out to just make this a little bit better, but I probably spent a whole day just implementing this. And the drawing itself is fairly straightforward, but what becomes tricky is all the different conditions for drawing this hit area depending on the relations of elements. And sometimes you'll get into weird scenarios where, see if I can maybe get like a offset one that overlaps. So now if there's not enough room, it's going to get pushed inwards. Come on, a little bit more. Well, it didn't work because it's overflowing the page. Terrible example. Yeah, so I wanted to just show you briefly how that's done. And this is where it gets, the only place where I'll get a little bit technical. And it's not overly technical. This is an SVG element. You've got the basic building blocks of what I'll demonstrate. There's two rectangles to represent the anchor and the menu. And then there's a path element, which is what we'll use to actually draw the hit area. The rectangles, are actually HTML elements in the real world scenario, but here they're just rectangles for show within the SVG, I mean. For this to work, some CSS, one day ahead of CSS day, well, this is CSS tomorrow, it's the real CSS day, I guess. For this to work, we need to disable pointer events for our SVG node. If we put an SVG element on top of our button, the whole rectangular SVG element would be clickable, so you wouldn't just click the path, not just the path would cover your mouse events, sorry, not just the path would capture your mouse events, but the whole rectangular SVG element would capture your mouse events. So we have to disable pointer events for it, and we have to enable pointer events for the inner path, so that only the path captures your mouse events. And then we use a little bit of scripting to draw this path. First off, we get the anchor and the menu bounding boxes, so they're X and Y in width and height, which are kind of all the coordinates we need to draw these lines. And then we get the path element, and we set its path data, or D attribute. And what follows next is just drawing commands. So we start by moving uppercase M, move to the top left corner of the anchor, draw a quadratic curve to the top left corner of the menu. Then we draw a vertical line by the height of the menu downwards, another quadratic curve inwards, from the bottom left to the bottom left. And just draw around the button as well. So this is a little bit interesting. Instead of just drawing a solid shape on top of the button, I draw around it. So there's the path goes inwards to not cover the button itself. And the reason for that is this menu component appears on top of the page. So if the button is clickable and the hit area were to cover the whole thing, you wouldn't be able to press the button anymore. So for that reason, I cut out the button from the hit area so you can still interact with the button, which lives in line in the page, without without blocking it with the hit area. And so, there were a couple of questions when I first did this and posted it on Twitter. There was, why is the line curved? Is, I think, an interesting observation. I started with a straight line for the hit areas, but that has the negative side effect of, if you have buttons stacked on top of each other, if you have another button up here, and you draw a straight line, that line would actually cover a lot of this button, this sibling button, which means it would be really hard to reach that. I would actually I'd struggle to reach the next button instead, which we definitely don't want. So that's why I went for a curved angle to cover the most likely trajectory. Right. So moving on. The way I tend to break up the work that I do on slides is we have like single purpose components, single purpose UI, or limited purpose, if you will. And on the other hand, we have a bucket of our core components. And I think when you break it up that way, it becomes very obvious that the time that you invest into your core components is kind of paid back multiple times over because of how often you use them. They're sort of your building blocks for assembling new pages, new features. So that got me thinking about some of the things that I specifically think are important to focus on and that I spend a lot of time focusing on when developing our UI and our components. And I wanted to talk about two specific things. First off is keyboard accessibility. I think is really important, for accessibility reasons, but also because we're a productivity app. People expect to be able to reach their UI through their keyboard, and you should be able to multi-select. You can go through an input pop-out. You can type in that, and the same thing goes for the menu, of course. If I disable the debug mode, if I can, there we are. I can tab into these. I can tab through. There's a clear focus of what I'm navigating through with my keyboard. So making sure that all of these components that are going to be reused a lot are fully keyboard accessible, I think really, really pays off. It means you can work more efficiently with them. And more importantly, second thing is layout flexibility. I think, and it sort of touches on what I showed with the menu before. I think not just in terms of responsive design also, like sure, these components should work on any screen size, but they should also work if I show a component in the top right corner or the bottom left corner, or if I scroll it out of view, like what happens then? All of these considerations to make sure that no matter what you throw at it, it will still work, I think is really important to add to that reuse value. So if I open up one of these pop-outs, we default to top alignment. If I don't have enough room up top, it will invert and align to the bottom. If there's not, well, if it's scroll out of view, it will just attach itself to the top of the screen. So you never lose track of it because you need to interact with this before you can get back to the rest of the page. And if I were to get into a scenario where I'm resizing inwards a little bit and the window needs to be offset, it will offset the pop-out, but the arrow will still remain firmly anchored on the action that I'm interacting with, again, to not lose that context of what this UI belongs to. So making sure that things are layout flexible in this way, I think is super worth it, because it means, and it has meant for me now, that I can kind of throw this component into any scenario and trust that it's going to work, no matter if you're using your fingers or your mouse or if it's in a weird place on the screen. It's always going to adapt and work. There's one more edge case. I'll show you if I can get this can go, and there we are. What if it doesn't? If the button is placed below the window itself, the arrow just goes away because it can't show an arrow pointing to the anchor anymore. So another is like super niche condition, like special condition. But because of all this work, and it's happened over time, it doesn't happen. It wasn't like the perfect component from the start. It's not perfect yet either. But it's flexible enough that it really saves me a ton of time when I'm putting together new features. So investing that time, I think, is really, really worth it. Slides exists in the productivity space, which comes with a bunch of expectations. If you're building an app for productivity or a UI like this, like a visual editing UI, I think there are a lot of expectations that come with that. And in our case, they carry over from desktop counterparts of our software, like Keynote, PowerPoint, etc. And you want to make sure to live up to those, because if you don't, you really hamper people's productivity. Like you're going to switch to Keynote, to our tool, and you can't use your common shortcuts. It becomes very, very frustrating, and you become very much less efficient. And I'm referring to things like, you should be able to drag and drop, I think is really, or say drag to select, I think is really important. Shortcuts like holding shift to remove or append from your selection. You can hold shift and drag to append multiple elements. You can right-click to duplicate elements, I think is also, it's a context menu, is something that a lot of people depend on. Not myself, maybe, but a lot of other people. So obviously, things like grids and guides are also critical to a lot of people that come from other software. And then one more shortcut that I think is, that I'm personally much dependent on, is when you resize something, being able to hold shift. I've grown up with this since Flash. You should be able to resize things proportionally. If you hold Alt, you should be able to resize around the center of where you started dragging. If you hold Shift and Alt, you resize proportionally around the center. So making sure to implement all of those things that people are accustomed to, I think, is super important. And each of those, maybe everybody won't use all of those, but the person who wants to resize proportionally, who won't be able to do that, if that interaction is not there, it's a real blocker. And again, going back to keyboard interactivity, I think keyboard shortcuts are another one of those things, like being able to use Command A to select all is a common thing. Cut and paste, and undo and nudging with your arrows, etc. And I think in some places, those are fairly obvious keyboard shortcuts because you've seen them in so many other places. But in some cases, keyboard accessibility requires a lot of creative thinking about your specific UI that you're building. So we recently added support for code highlights, which means you can type a range of line numbers. I want to highlight lines 1 through 3. So I type those line numbers. And I thought a lot about how this would work with your keyboard, because it's an interface where you type. So I really don't want to go over to my mouse to click this add highlight step, right? So enter adds a new input field. These are 2 separate input fields. And I'll highlight some more lines. We'll do 4 through 6. Enter again, I'll add a couple more. And now when I want to delete a line, again, I don't have to go over to the X to delete this. I can just backspace through the whole field until it's empty. And when it's empty, I can hit backspace to remove it. So these are all really customly implemented for this specific scenario. If I hold Command, I can move a field up and down too to rearrange them. And I think the obvious thing to do here when I tab, traditionally kind of default web behavior would be to tab over to the X button and highlight it with the blue outline, and then you press Enter. But really, that's not the most efficient behavior that you're looking to do here with your keyboard. So really trying to kind of remove some of your default thinking around keyboard, I think it really helps sometimes. And really think about how keyboard accessibility makes sense for this specific use case. Right. The next area I wanted to talk about is animations. I love working with animations. You saw my little checkboxes before. That's one example. I think animations in a UI, even like ours, like a productivity tool, play a really important role. They're much more than just visual flair, of course. Nobody would argue against that, I think, anymore. And I think because of how important they are, if you use animations wrong, you can have a very detrimental effect on the user experience. Specifically, you can make a UI feel really slow and sluggish. An app I love is Figma. I don't use design tools. I only play around with them to try the interactions. But Figma, like their UI has no animations almost, and I love that. It's just so responsive and fast. But I'm not as cutthroat as that. Like I love animations too much, so I still use them. But I think it's important to play them down. And if you took something like Figma and you added like fading transitions to all their menus, you would take what is actually a super performant app and make it perceived as if it were slow and sluggish. So you really want to be careful around how you use animations in a productivity tool especially. And the way I try to benchmark this in my head is an animation that I create should never get in the way of what the user is trying to do. I think I've hit the right level of animations if you don't even think about them actually happening. They just kind of are backdrops smoothly carrying you from one place to another. So that's the way that I try to focus on animations. And I wanted to highlight a few different thoughts that I have around it and how I work with animations in the slides editor and other UI as well. First off, one rule that I've had with me for a really long time, and rule sounds very strict, but one guideline, is to focus on how things animate in and not how they animate out. Focus on how things are being brought into view because that's the next thing you're going to be focusing on, and not how they go out of view. For example, if I wanted to take the action of adding speaker notes to this slide, I'd press the speaker notes button, which creates a very brief animation where the speaker notes window just very quickly scales up and the black overlay fades in. But once I'm done with this and I close it out, there's no animation, no transition at all. And that's very intentional. When I'm signaling that I want to add speaker notes, we're animating something that I care about, that I want to go to, the next thing I want to interact with. So it makes sense to bring that in a good way and draw attention to it even more. But once I'm done with this, I hit save. What I'm saying by hitting save now is I want to go back and edit my slide. So if we were to animate the speaker notes window at that time, we'd be attracting attention to something which is completely irrelevant to me as a user because I'm done with this UI. So that's why I think it's important to animate in and not animate out. Or focusing on at least playing up the animations in and playing down the animations out. Animations, in my opinion, are the most useful when you can use them to guide people, your users' focus, tell them where to look or what just happened. An example, if I go to my deleted decks, my trash, and I recover one of these decks, you get thrown back to your profile page again or my decks. And then there's a brief pause where there's an empty space before the deck is brought into view. And what that does is you come back to this whole different page or different screen again. And the last thing that moves, because we have a short delay there, is going to be the deck that you recovered. So we're kind of telling you, look at me, pay attention to this thing. And I think that's a very good way to use animations in a UI. I also, like I said, I think animations can really tell even more than that. And this is a common frustration for me personally in UIs where I have drag and drop. If I drag something and I try to drop it on the right drop zone, and even if it's successful, like there's nothing really confirming it, so I don't know if it worked or not. And if I drop it outside, there's also no difference in action. So I don't really know if my dragging and dropping worked. So what I did for our little drag and dropping is when you drop an element here, if I miss it, they just kind of fall down. But if let's select one more. If I draw, oh, I deselected instead. There we are. If I draw these 3 elements and I drop them onto the tag, they zoom into the tag, which seems maybe a little bit over the top, but it really shows you, that these elements were absorbed by the thing you wanted to drop into. And I think it's fine to be a little bit playful like that too. And the thing bounces too. So they zoom into the button bounces. You really can't miss that your drop was successful. And I may have overplayed it because of how frustrated I've been with other UIs that don't actually indicate at all if it was successful. But yeah, I love using animations, and I think animations have a really good purpose used like that too. Going back to the editor again, another case where I try to use animations is to visualize things transforming between different states, which sounds very abstract, but really isn't. If I add a shape to this slide, and I wanted to add an animation to that shape, I'll press the animation button, which expands out a couple of options, and when I remove it again, it collapses out of view. So it animates in and out for a different purpose. If we were to not transition this behavior, you'd press this button, and instantly everything from this point downwards would be replaced, which means that I would be left having to figure out what was there before and what's new. So by just adding a simple animation in a case like this, you can really show what is being pushed down, what is the new thing that's appearing. So my brain can kind of just ignore this element because I see it being pushed down. I can just focus on the new stuff that's appearing. So again, the animation is really telling me what to focus on, what to look at. And finally, I as much as I advocate using animations sparingly, as you saw with the drop effect there before, I tend to splurge here and there. But I try to do it in a way that doesn't get in the way of the user experience or in how fast you can work. So here's another example where if you edit a tag, I think these kind of over-the-top-ish animations where this thing flips over and you can edit your tag name and you save it and it flips back again. It's fun for me to work on, number one, and I think it's a fun little thing to run into as long as it doesn't get in the way of how fast I can actually take this action. You'll notice, the moment I press the button, the field is already highlighted. I could start typing instantly. So it's not getting in my way. It's just adding a little bit of VFX. So another topic I wanted to talk about a little bit is I just believe it's incredibly important to try to make work enjoyable. And I think all of us in this room are fortunate enough to work in a field where we at least enjoy some part of what we do. Maybe not all of it, but we all have our special interests. For me, it's always been about exploring and coming up with UI concepts and creating weird animations and experiments. And I've made a point of doing that work in slides on my slides time, even though that work very seldomly aligns with our business goals or bottom line or whatever business term you want to use. And I think those pointless projects that don't necessarily add to our business, I think are still super meaningful to me personally because I get to work on something that I really enjoy doing, and it keeps me motivated into wanting to continue working on slides in the long term. And maybe a little bit unique to the scenario of working on your own company where I really want to keep doing this. I love doing it, but I think if I only focused on the things we should be focusing on, like advertising and funnels and markety and businessy, I'd get very, very bored with it. Those are not the things that I enjoy in my work. So I try to make a point of working on things that don't make sense, just to make sure that I remain motivated. And I think that's really important to try to do in your work wherever you can. An example of that, so we were building out a developers documentations page. We have a bunch of developer features, and we needed a little navigation for that page. So if you go to slides.com developers, we needed one of those table of contents things there on the left side where you can show what's available on this incredibly long page. And after 3 hours, I had a working menu with the text being highlighted, and then after 3 days, I had a snake, which scrolls with you and shows you what's in view using SVG. So this is a good example of that. I mean, it's completely superfluous, functionality-wise, but it was really, really fun to work on. And for the people who arrive on this page, I think it might be a fun little detail to encounter too. It expands to highlight exactly what's in view right now. So if I go to element classes, we have 2 sections in view at the same time, and it expands to cover those 2 sections. I don't know if I can zoom out to get more sections in view, maybe. But yeah, it's functional, it's quirky, and it was really fun to work on. So I don't regret spending 3 days building this thing, is my point, yes. Right. This is also something that's available open source. It's on my GitHub, github.com, HakimL, and I think the repository is /CSS. I have a bunch of stuff gathered together there because I think it's easier than starting new repositories for everything. Yeah. Ooh, that's my optional slide. Do I show my optional slide? Yes. Okay. Yes, I do. So going back to the editor again, is another component that I'm really happy with how it turned out. And again, no, we don't need the debug mode. We need the tutorial. There we are. Oh, and we need a new deck, not an existing deck. The first time you start using slides, you get to the editor, and my URL is all messed up. And we have this little tutorial component. And I'm really happy with this, how this came out. So instead of trying to record a video or collect a bunch of images and tell you how the app works, on the higher level, we just show you by actually interacting with the app. So this gives you an overview of the core things that are available, the different areas of the editor. It cuts out that portion of the page. It says in very simple terms what it is. But where it gets interesting is, it's not just using a fixed version of the page. This is the page it's interacting with the actual page. So if I press next now, it's telling me this is a text block on the slide. But when I press next, it actually clicks that text block, which changes the toolbar on the left side. So it's interacting with the real page on the screen size that you're on, in your environment, which I think makes for a really good tutorial. Another example is when you're now defocused or deselected it, and when you add a new slide, again, we click on that element, we show that content, and we recently redesigned that whole slide selector, so now we didn't have to update an image or anything. It was just already there and already working. The tutorial is automatically up to date. So this is a component I'm really happy with, and it's another UI pattern that I think worked really well. Right. And without further ado, I thank you very much for having me. Oh, I'll be there.
I don't think I'm the only one who heard a lot of pop sounds, brains exploding. That was amazing.
Thank you.
So all those mind-blowing experiments, we're talking about technical stuff now. So
yes.
do you use a favorite JavaScript framework or animation library or stuff like that?
I very rarely do. I am a big believer in reinventing the wheel, which sounds very backwards, but I think, to really learn something, sometimes you have to go back and do repetitive work, do something that even though other people have done it better before. And I think that can really pay off. That's kind of how I learned a lot of my UI development. When I worked in Flash, you got very little for free, and you had to write, I wrote my own scroll bar logic. So that gets you thinking about what happens when you click the empty scroll bar area, how far does it scroll, and what's the interaction when you press the arrows, and kind of really, really thinking through the minute details of the UI that way.
You do all that in vanilla JavaScript?
Yes. Yeah, well, we use specific micro libraries for specific things. We don't use an overarching library. I use the SVG I'm drawing myself, yes. I use manually.
I know that dealing with SVG using vanilla JavaScript is a big pain in the neck, though.
A little bit, but...
a little bit? A
little bit, not too bad, not too bad. Yeah.
I don't feel dumped at all.
You know what, it's really paid off. It's we've done it, because we've done everything vanilla, and I know how everything works, and we're kind of not dependent on frameworks that much on a critical basis. So when we started slides, we would have used I'll just redact the name, but given framework of the day, which actually wouldn't even be well maintained or supported anymore today, which would have been really sad. And when I worked at Squarespace, we used, what's the Yahoo version of YUI, and they really invested in that, and they can't really get away from it. So I try to stay away from the bigger JavaScript frameworks where I can.
I have so many questions. It's really hard to pick among them. So regarding the modal design pattern, a few questions popped up about usability, whether you do tests with users. You mentioned keyboard accessibility, but are they also screen reader accessible?
We have focused on screen reader accessibility for our presentations, not for the whole platform. I can't say that we have. I would love to. We are. I mean, like I said, we're a two-person team. There's a lot of areas where we're lacking, and that's just the reality of it. If you want to try to spread two people across building, we have 1 million users. Building this platform, maintaining it, we have to wear a lot of hats, and I'd love to do more user testing. I get feedback through our help forums. That's my only user testing at this point, but I'd love to do more. So
you turned an open source personal project into a full-time gig.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Slowly over time. I'm not Mr. Entrepreneur who will just go all in, take my savings, and I took it slowly. We started it on the side of our jobs. My co-founder and I was working at Squarespace at the time, did it in my weekends, my free time, which was, I had plenty of free time before having kids, honestly. And it slowly grew to the point where I could come on full time, and then Owen can come on full time as well. So it's just happened gradually. We're still a completely independent business. We don't have any investors to report to, anybody who needs to, who's asking us for reports, monthly reports or anything like that.
So there's just one thing that's been itching me and probably a couple of people too. So the hover menu, the pretty awesome one, does it also work on click? Because there is no hover on touch or mobile devices.
Yes, of course. Yeah, all of our UI works on touch devices too. It will just work with taps instead. And the same component can be triggered through click on your keyboard or on a computer as well. So in some cases, we use a click action where it's going to be finicky to try to go with your mouse. We care a lot about working on touch devices. Obviously, it's the future.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was very inspiring.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.